So, Kajiji, shall I start?
Yes, you can get started and I'll put us on Facebook Live, but you can begin.
Okay, fantastic. Well,
Ajifanta, do you want to go ahead? I think Anika.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Sorry, we're having technical difficulties. I think Anika can't, her screen's not functioning or something. But so we'll get started. I'll introduce our speaker today. Dr. Nebil Husayn, and then once Anika, let's talk about what our diversity speakers of the speaker today. So my name is Ajifanta Marina, and I'm the advocacy program coordinator at MCN, is to use civic education and leadership development to advocate for and shape the narrative on what it means to be Muslims in America. And our diversity speaker series specifically seeks to deepen understanding about Islam and Muslims, and we bring forth speakers and experts to answer your questions about Islam and Muslims to help shed light on our uncommon misconceptions shared about Islam. And with this mission, it is important to us to amplify the voices, stories, and contributions of all diverse Muslim communities that we work with. And without a doubt, Dr. Husayn's presentation captures the essence of our goal and to educate and expand the world's view of what it means to be Muslim.
yes.
Okay.
Thank you. I apologize. My screen froze and I don't know if you can still see me on my camera. It seems like my camera doesn't work again. But anyway, I just want to welcome our distinguished guest, Professor Nebil Husayn again. Thank you for being here. And as my colleague mentioned, the Diversity Education Series is a platform to bring the diverse voices that are and that exist in Islam, the diverse perspectives and the diverse schools of thought that make up the Muslim community. We want to be able to highlight and share these stories and provide a thought leadership in the area of showing that Muslims are a diverse group of folks and that we have talents and we have leadership in many different forms, whether it is from faith perspective, from a civic perspective, from a scholarly perspective. And so we are really honored again to have our guest, Professor Husayn here, talking about an often misinterpreted story about the story of Ali and the schism between Sunni and Shia, which even ourselves as Muslims we don't know that well. So very, very excited to hear this presentation.
Thank you, Anika. And sorry, Dr. Husayn, without further ado, I'm gonna quickly go through your bio so the audience know who you are and your background. Specialist in the field of Islamic studies. His research explores authoritarianism in the Middle East, debates on the caliphate and development of Islamic thought. Dr. Husayn began his work as an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, where he studied Arabic, Persian, and Islamic history before pursuing study abroad in Syria and Yemen for 4 years. Wow. He used the opportunity to pursue a seminary education with traditionally trained Muslim scholars. Dr. Husayn obtained his PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University and University. He is also the recipient of a Fulbright Award and University of Miami Fellowship in the Arts and Humanities. Dr. Husayn is the author of Opposing the Imam, which examines the history of early Muslims who were hostile to Islam's fourth Caliph, Ali, and his descendants, so which today's presentation will be focused on. Dr. Husayn enjoys teaching a variety of courses and topics. They include the legacy of Malcolm X and the Black Panthers of New York, early Islamic history, gender, Muslim spirituality and geopolitics, atheism, and faith-based claims that invite skepticism. Wow, so he does it all basically. So Dr. Husayn, it is an honor to have you here today. Thank you. You can get started.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'd like to thank you all for being here today. And if you can hear me, I guess let me know, or if you can't hear me, let me know. But I'll turn up my mic. I'd like to thank you all for taking time out of your busy days and busy schedules to hear me talk about theology and early writing in the Muslim community. I'd also like to thank the organizers of this event, the Muslim Community Network, for this chance to share some of the ideas that I've been thinking about for the past 8 years. So let's begin. So how did we get here? Ali ibn Abi Talib, the fourth caliph in Islamic history, the man at the center of the portrait before you, was the close kinsman of the Prophet Muhammad, who married Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, and thus became the father of all of the Prophet's grandchildren. He's revered for his wisdom, his swordsmanship, and piety. He almost needs no introduction. He's revered as a saint among most Muslims, and for many, he's the second holiest figure after the Prophet Muhammad. He's assassinated in 660 of the Common Era after 4 turbulent years as caliph. The ghettoizing of Ali in Muslim culture and in academia is quite common. His life and political career is usually only discussed in the context of Shiism. The same can be said about his famous son Hassan, who's depicted on your left, and his son Hussein, who's depicted on your right. The latter being famously killed in a large-scale massacre that's commemorated each year in Shi'i culture. There's an unspoken rule that these heroes of Shiism and the life they led after the Prophet's death is only to be discussed in Shi'i settings or in Sunni settings that aim to implicitly or explicitly discredit Shi'i doctrines about these figures and their political careers. So why write this book? This book aims to provide a context and a space to understand the tensions, the stories, and the evolution of understandings about the political lives of these figures in non-Shi'i settings. Thus, I directed my attention primarily to Sunnism, studying Sunni hadith considered canonical and others that were not. I turned to the literature of another school of thought prevalent in Oman and in North Africa, known as the Ibadis. And then I also look at the literature of an early influential and rationalist theological school known as the Mu'tazila. I do this to understand the diverse ways in which the stories of Ali and his son Hussein are told by Muslims outside of the context of Shiism. The impetus to write this book came from the discovery that this venerated Sunni caliph and Shi'i imam, and here I'm speaking of Ali, was once publicly reviled in Muslim societies, meaning that he was cursed from the pulpit every Friday or every Jum'ah. I hope to understand the processes that facilitated the rehabilitation of Ali's tarnished reputation in Sunni Islam. I also aim to understand the claims of Ali's antagonists and their grievances against him in particular. The relative obscurity and/or extinction of sects upholding such views required that I look at Muslim literature across a number of genres. I engage in the first detailed study of the claims and arguments of Muslims who were opposed to the caliphate of Ali. Lastly, I wanted to understand the ways in which the views of early antagonists to Ali endure in Islamic theology and in literature until today. So what are some key terms that we can try to use to understand early Islamic literature and history? There are many schools of thought within the religion of Islam, each one consisting of revered scholars who define what is orthodoxy. And so what is this word orthodoxy? It's this idea that there is a correct belief in the sight of God, and that as believers, we have to follow orthodoxy, or that correct belief in the sight of God. This evening, I want to consider the ways in which Sunnism, the largest doctrinal school in the Muslim world, grappled with the diversity of stories and views on the life of Ali. Second, when I speak of canonical hadith, I'm speaking of those sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that were compiled in the Sunni tradition that came to be sources for orthodoxy and orthopraxy. So orthopraxy refers to ritual laws. If orthodoxy is about right beliefs, orthopraxy is about the right way of doing things. So this refers to ritual and Islamic law. So the most revered collection is the one that is referred to in Arabic as Al-Jami' al-Sahih, or the authentic collection of a scholar named Bukhari, who was active 200 to 250 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death. I don't want to get into the details, but the canonical culture around this book is one where faithful Sunnis believe that in terms of historicity, this collection is basically unimpeachable. It's comprised of hadith that are considered bona fide sayings of the Prophet. Other revered collections may have authentic reports in them as well, but don't share the same stature as Bukhari in being reliable from cover to cover. You could say these other respected books can be used as references, and scholars can investigate their contents for possibly authentic reports. At the other end of the spectrum are biographical dictionaries and historical collections, or historical texts. If you were a Sunni scholar who wished to define orthodoxy and you found a text that disagreed with your sensibilities, and it came from one of these non-canonical sources, the choice was easy. You could simply dismiss the authenticity of the text. You just throw it out. Since I consider Muslim literature across multiple genres, I compare claims about Ali made in all of these different types of works, while acknowledging those times in which the source is canonical, and then acknowledging those times in which they are not. Now, the tensions that arise are when a scholar or a believer finds a text in a canonical source like Bukhari's, but it disagrees with their sensibilities. And in my book and in the final chapter of it, this is something I discuss in detail. What are the ways in which scholars dealt with these types of tensions? Lastly, I want to stake some territory for reverence for Ali in Sunni culture, or I can say reverence for Ali in non-Shi'i circles. This explains the phenomenon of hundreds of hadith praising him in Sunni literature, and non-Shi'i theologians who painstakingly argued against other members of their school on why Ali was a rightfully guided caliph, why he was a saint, why he was a spiritual heir to the Prophet, when many of their peers doubted or scoffed at such positions as only those that belong to Shi'is. I'd argue that while the earliest partisans of Ali may have had the identifier Shi'i, which in Arabic means partisan or follower of Ali, it expanded beyond this group to include Muslims who revered him while having political and theological allegiances elsewhere. Thus, reverence for Ali or pro-Ali sentiment over 3 centuries that followed his death came to be a trans-sectarian phenomenon, meaning it was not just part of Shi'ism, but gradually became part of Sunnism as well. Only a minority of Muslims followed a school dedicated to Ali and his family, or what became known as Shi'ism. The majority of Muslims until today understood religious and political authority as falling on all of the Prophet's companions or Sahaba, rather than just his family. This hegemonic belief in the widespread authority that existed after the Prophet, rather than just being restricted and limited to his family, is a cornerstone belief of Sunni Islam. So it's with that introduction that I want to briefly consider the contours of pro-Ali sentiment and to understand the stature of Ali through Muslim literature about him. At the very end of chapter 33, verse 33 of the Quran, the verse reads, "Indeed, God desires to keep all impurities from you, O members of the house, and purify you a thorough purification. إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا. It's known as the verse of purity or ayat al-tathir. And it's related in canonical sources that the Prophet took his daughter Fatima, Ali, and their two sons Hassan and Hussein, and prayed that God purified them when this verse was revealed. Muslims understood the Prophet's prayer to have been accepted and answered. The community also agrees that Ali is the only caliph raised by the Prophet from infancy, from when he was a baby. On this subject, there are collections that exist about Ali's sayings, letters attributed to him that were compiled in a Shi'i work known as the Nahj al-Balagha, and it expands on this idea of Ali being in the house of the Prophet from infancy with details, with a detailed account from Ali himself. And so if you read one of these texts or one of these excerpts from Ali, he reportedly states, "Certainly you know my special status in the eyes of God's messenger and the close kinship I share with him. When I was only a child, he took charge of me and he brought me into his home. When I was a baby, he would hold me to his chest and cradle me in his arms. When I slept, I did so in his bed and beside him, so close that I could smell his fragrance. To feed me, he would first chew the food and then offer it to me. As a child, never did he find me speaking a lie, nor any foolishness in my actions." Here we see Ali discussing how he was the only person among the Prophet's companions to be raised in his home. He states that even as a child, he was obedient to the Prophet and followed the path of virtue. For Shi'is, these statements reflect the infallibility of Ali, a doctrine upheld as orthodoxy in Shia Islam. And so this excerpt continues, "God then sent a mighty angel to the Prophet in order to guide him both day and night along the path of fine morals and the perfection of character. During this time, I followed him like a young camel who follows the footprints of its mother. Every day he would stand as a banner and symbol of righteousness and morality and command me to follow him. Every year he would retreat and seclude himself in the mountains and the caves of Hira. There I would see him where no one else would see him. In those days, Islam did not exist in any house except in the house of God's Prophet. He lived in his house with his wife Khadija. And after these two, I was the third. I saw the light of divine revelation and breathed in the scent of prophethood." Now, the question of authenticity aside, there is a sense here that the intent of this monologue is to convince the listener that Ali is clearly the best person to follow and to trust after the Prophet. Ali is telling his audience that he had a uniquely intimate relationship with the Prophet. The implicit argument is that others cannot claim to be superior to him in their knowledge of the Prophet or in being closer to him. It's true that the Prophet approved of Ali in ways that were unique. One indication of this is that the Prophet declined all other marriage proposals from prominent Muslims who wanted to marry his daughter Fatima. Both he and Fatima held that only Ali would be a suitable spouse for her. Shi'is believed that Fatima had a piety or spiritual stature that was peerless among women, and so her spouse was also to resemble her in this peerlessness. It can be said with confidence that the Prophet viewed Ali as his apprentice and trusted companion. This is something that's accepted within Sunni Islam. It's for this reason that the Prophet says about Ali, "He is of my essence and I am of his." Or in another report, "Ali and myself are raised from the same light." Or, "You are my brother in this world and in the hereafter. You are unto me as Aaron was unto Moses." So far, we've considered characteristics of Ali that are affirmed in canonical sources. And now when we turn to non-canonical hadith, statements that medieval Sunni scholars did not affirm were authentic, we get into murkier waters. You could say the claims get more provocative. And so let's look at another example. Historians note that the Prophet said of Ali, "You are my heir, vizier, and successor after me." This sounds pretty straightforward regarding whom the Prophet favored as his successor. But there's a part of the statement that copyists of manuscripts could not agree on. In some places, the Prophet says, "Fi ahli," among my family. And in others, the statement is "Fi ummati." The ramifications of either statement are predictably enormous, otherwise I wouldn't be bringing it up. So according to one manuscript, the Prophet is simply noting that Ali will be the next chief of his family, namely the Hashemite tribe to which they both belonged. In another, the statement is much wider in scope. The Prophet is appointing him as his successor to the entire community. Since we have both versions in Sunni hadith collections, we're left asking, is this a Shia affirming text, a smoking gun that is defanged of its bite? Or is it an innocuous text enhanced with a Shia accretion? The authors I study in my book, especially in chapters 3 and 5, namely Al-Jahid, the Mu'tazili, and Ibn Taymiyyah, a famous Sunni, are adamant in supporting the second theory. So in this case, they are sure the Prophet said, fi ahli, that Ali is my successor only among my family or in my tribe. But later she's amended the text so it would read fi ummati, so that Ali was his successor in the entire Muslim community. It's with this assumption they went about blunting, meaning Ibn Taymiyyah and Jahid, the polemical edge of any pro-Ali hadith that they found which suggested that he should be caliph. They argue either Shi'is made up these reports, embellished them, or read them out of their original context. After the Prophet's death, the question of who would succeed him fragmented his companions into a number of factions. The allegiances grew in their complexities as the decades passed. Here, I'll try to start with simplicity and then gradually add to this knowledge base to help us frame the disagreements. First, there are those who supported authority going to the most senior members of the community who had the most clout. This faction became partisans of the first three caliphs, Abu Bakr, Omar, and Uthman. Not only did they revere the memory of these three and view them as pious authorities, but also they based Islamic law and knowledge of religion on the followers of these three caliphs. The second faction consisted of those who believed Ali was the natural heir to the Prophet. The clan to which both the Prophet and Ali belonged was that of Hashim. Hashemite kinsmen and their partisans held Ali to be the most knowledgeable and distinguished of the Prophet's disciples and revered him after his death when other Muslims did not. The third faction to consider is represented by the clan of Ali's predecessor, Uthman ibn Affan. These were the Umayyads. Now, Uthman was assassinated after a siege of his home that lasted weeks, if not months. And the family of Uthman blamed Ali for these events since those who had laid siege to the caliph's home had respected Ali. Although Ali may not have been involved in the assassination, the Umayyads considered anyone who had criticized Uthman culpable in this hyper-partisan atmosphere that believed, if you're not with us, you're against us, and fomented tribal feuds. Thus, when Ali became the fourth caliph, the Umayyads rebelled against him. To Ali's dismay, the partisans of the first three caliphs rebelled against him as well, and thus his caliphate was rocked with civil war after civil war. To take a bird's eye view of how it all panned out, after Ali's assassination, the Umayyads take the reins of the caliphate and turn it into a dynastic monarchy. They rule for close to a century. Then there's a wide-scale revolt that foments from Central Asia and heads west to topple them in Arabia. The leaders of this revolt pledge allegiance to the old rivals of the Umayyads, i.e. the Hashemids. And the Hashemids have their own monarchy for 5 centuries until another army, the Mongols, lay siege to their empire and end their rule. Now, if we wanted to take snapshots of allegiances to different religious and political authorities 100 years after the Prophet, it would look something like this. You'd have 4 factions with one of them split in 2, so making 5. You'd have those who revere the first 3 caliphs, those who revere the Umayyad dynasty, those who followed the Khariji school, an independent school discussed in the book, but which we won't tonight. And then lastly, you have the pro-Ali faction split between those who say all authority should remain exclusive to Ali's family, and those who revered Ali and his descendants, but were more broad in viewing members of the community or other members of the community as authorities as well. For example, there may be some who viewed the first 2 caliphs as wise and pious leaders, but also respected Ali. They didn't view reverence for these different caliphs as necessarily contradictory. Now, if we try to take another snapshot 200 years after the Prophet's death, these different circles would still be intact with the caveat that there is now a religious elite, scholars of the law and theology who have become fed up with caliphs claiming to be the successors to the Prophet. They are the drivers of a new ethic, that the ulama are warathatul anbiya, or that the scholars are the real heirs of the Prophet, compared to the previous ethic that The Khulafa or Warathat al-Anbiya, the caliphs were the successors to the Prophet. So while you have scholars that identify with the above factions, there is a set of centrist scholars who keep an ethic of we will not judge, because we don't have enough certainty on who was right and who was wrong in all of these conflicts that occurred 2 centuries before. So we'll leave it to God to decide who to punish and who to reward in the hereafter. Some even had a more radical optimism. They said, we might have our own theories on who was right and who was wrong, but we'll maintain belief that God will forgive everyone who was involved because they were companions of the Prophet. Now, if we wanted to locate Sunnism, it's part of this burgeoning community of centrist scholars who acknowledge that their own teachers and authorities were part of one of these factions, even if centrists themselves were not. Thus, to read a Sunni Hadith collection is to read a work with contributions from those who are pro-3 Caliph, pro-Umayyad, pro-Ali, or centrist. By contrast, it's fairly easy to read a Shi'i work and understand their allegiances or sources. They're mostly written by partisans of the family of Ali who viewed them as the rightful imams or leaders of the community, both in terms of political power and religion. Our last snapshot is taken 300 years after the Prophet's death. While I don't want to diminish the existence of other factions and schools within and outside of Sunnism and Shiism, in terms of the enduring culture surrounding Ali, I would describe Muslims as having one of 6 different views. The first group is made up of zealous pro-3 Caliph, pro-Umayyad, or Khariji Muslims who publicly condemn Ali and his partisans as evil. The second group doesn't condemn Ali outright, but opposes any special veneration of him. They tend to say he was a fallible person who may have committed blunders and that he may have harmed the Muslim community when he became caliph. In fact, some denied that he had ever become a legitimate caliph to begin with. The third group became the orthodox position of Sunnism. Ali is accepted as the 4th rightly guided caliph. The fourth group regarded him as the greatest Muslim after the Prophet, but didn't consider him divinely appointed. They held that Ali was the wisest and most meritorious Muslim after the Prophet Muhammad, but didn't go so far as to say that Muhammad appointed him as his successor. The fifth group became the orthodox position of Shiism. Ali was the rightful heir of the Prophet, selected by God and the Prophet before Muhammad's death. The sixth group was made up of Shi'is that viewed Ali as a manifestation of God. In late antiquity, the belief in humans either being divine or demigods was quite commonplace. It seems most cultures believed that about rulers or had myths of this type regarding holy men. It seems foreign to us now, but for the exception of Christianity, where God or the Word is made flesh in Jesus. In this circle, stories about Ali's miraculous power over the universe, his omniscience and omnipotence were a common motif. The absolute monotheism that is usually associated with Islam made Group 6 very marginal and condemned by both Sunnis and Twelver Shi'i orthodoxy. If the spectrum could be laid out from 1 through 6, or those who held animosity for Ali, all the way down to those who believed in his divinity, it would look something like this slide. All of this might seem a bit rudimentary, but I promise you the reason why I'm discussing this is that no one else has mapped out these nuances or the spectrum. The go-to model is anachronistic and tends to imagine Sunnism and Shiism as 2 branches that split apart at the Prophet's death. While the argument may require some charitable readings, my argument would be this. Sunnism is so wide in scope that its literature preserves members who seem to occupy all 6 groups. If I was asked, I could place a Sunni scholar in each group. Shiism, by contrast, would only occupy groups 4 through 6 on the spectrum. So to sum up, Group 1 held animosity for Ali, Group 2 avoided his praise and veneration, Group 3 accepted him as a rightly guided caliph, Group 4 held him to be superior to all other disciples of the Prophet, Group 5 held that God and the Prophet had anointed him Muhammad's rightful heir, and Group 6 upheld Ali's divinity. So, if we were to zoom out to 300 years after the Prophet's death, it's here that we can be certain people self-identify as Sunni or Shi'i. We can also discuss some of the cultural currents associated with a layperson belonging to each faction. And what is it that we find? Shi'is can be accurately described as centering Ali and the Prophet's family at the core of their religious culture. They have separate circles of learning, separate books, and rituals that Sunnis do not. For pro-Ali Sunnis, by this point, they've come to revere Ali in very similar ways to Shi'i laypersons. He's a hero. He's remembered as unparalleled in wisdom and in combat. And the Prophet's descendants are also revered in Sunni societies as nobility. And then we have those Sunnis who are skeptical of all of this reverence for Ali and the authenticity of hadith that praise him. They tend to show sympathy for the Umayyads and scholars who are anti-Shi'i. Thus, when they discuss history, it's one that aims to discredit pro-Ali arguments and texts. And then there are those Sunnis who are mostly neutral on history, either in being uninformed or consciously not wanting to wade into controversial waters. Some Sunni laypersons remained aloof. The cultural code here is that I don't want to accidentally say something about a sacred figure that will offend God and who will then punish me in the hereafter. As a result, I neither discuss nor take any position regarding these political conflicts. Now, if the previous slide discussed laypersons, then here we can take a moment to consider the efforts of Sunni scholars who viewed themselves as representatives of orthodoxy. First, they sought to suppress and condemn overt anti-Ali sentiment in Sunni literature that was transmitted. It became heresy to curse Ali or accuse him of sinfulness. So searching for these texts at times feels like looking for needles in a haystack. While I want to take all the credit for finding these exceptional cases by browsing and reading every single volume cover to cover, my work is profoundly aided in the digital world where I can use string searches to go through databases that have digitized thousands of medieval Islamic texts. Second, Sunni scholars aim to discredit any whiff of Shi'ism. This included texts portraying Ali as superior to his predecessors or noting any disagreements he had with them. For example, after the Prophet's death, when Ali, Fatima, and the Prophet's family had disagreements with the first Caliph Abu Bakr, some scholars rationalized that such reports were likely false because it didn't sit well with them to see these figures portrayed in conflict with one another. Third, scholars circulated reports in which Ali appeared as a fallible person. They may have done this unintentionally for two reasons. First, this organically happened whenever they drew on the legacy or the contributions of those who were pro-3 Caliph or pro-Umayyad living 2 centuries before. And second, it was infidelity to their belief in the canonical culture of hadith or the historicity of reports in these sacred collections that led scholars to say, well, in this case, Ali must have upset the Prophet. A famous example in the collection of Bukhari is when the Prophet visits the home of Ali and Fatima for night prayers and they refuse to join him and the Prophet rebukes them, or another report where Ali tries to marry the daughter of Abu Jahl and the Prophet delivers a sermon also rebuking Ali. 2 centuries after the fall of the Umayyads, Ali was now a respected figure in Sunni culture. In this new context, scholars now always assumed that Ali would be forgiven and the error at stake was not so egregious as to lead him to be condemned. It's here we see how the reception of literature antagonistic to Ali in its origins can end up in circles that will charitably read it as not to condemn him, as the original authors certainly intended. Let me close by stating that partisanship and the polarization of society outlasted the lifetimes of the 7th century rulers of Arabia. Muslim literature, both canonical and non-canonical, preserves the sentiments of all of these factions. A study of the formation of Sunni orthodoxy regarding Ali is a study of all of these sentiments. Lastly, I'd argue that polarization in American politics today is reminiscent of 7th century Hashemid and Umayyad rivalries and the historiography that ensued. President Obama is viewed as a good person and righteous leader by many, but he's reviled as evil and illegitimate by a rival tribe. 200 years from now, there will be partisans of Obama and many historians who will praise him, but also a threat of antagonists relying on Fox News reporting, right-wing authors, or foreign journalists who will claim that Obama was not the praiseworthy person that people remember, especially when they look at his legacy in terms of war. The same goes for Trump, who's a polarizing figure with avid followers. As we speak, we're creating competing historiographies and leaving them for posterity. As the decades pass, let us not be surprised with the spectrum that unfolds as it did in Islamic history. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Nabil. That was really, really amazing. Just all the amazing just notes that you shared, really detailed presentation. And I could, even from the chat, everyone is learning so much, and you share such really great perspectives. So we really want to thank you for taking the time to walk us through what you know really well, and making it accessible and available to all of us in this audience. With that, sorry, I apologize, I cannot be on video at the exact moment, but with that, we are going to move into Q&A. We want this to be a place where everyone in the audience can interact with Professor Nabil, ask questions, provide comments. So you can either put your question directly into the chat, and we will ask it to Professor Nabil. If you would like, we can also unmute you if you want to ask your question directly. Yeah, we want this to be a conversation and a forum for us to all grow intellectually and spiritually. And so with that, we'll open for Q&A.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi,
Hello,
Anika. It's good to
Faida.
see you guys.
Hey,
Thanks
good
for
to
doing
see
this.
you, Faida. Awesome. Thank you for being here. And you have
Professor
the
Sen,
floor.
this was a great presentation. I am a Shia, somewhat in spectrums 4 and 5 along the spectrum. I'm a self-questioning Shia. So lots of questions. And I didn't used to question so much, but I've started questioning a lot more. My parents are pretty orthodox, but I don't think they would count me as a Shia anymore. But I have some questions if you have time. I'm curious about what you think about the events in Mubahila and how you kind of interpret them, because that for Shias is like, the public declaration of Hazrat Ali's vicegerency, I guess. I don't know if I said that right. So that's one thing. And then just the stories about Hazrat Ali's birth, where Shia Orthodoxy has it that he's, was born in the Kaaba. And I'm just wondering if you could address these two things. I really enjoyed listening to you, and I'm now on your website trying to download some of your papers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the two questions were Mubahila and being born in the Kaaba. Okay. All right. So in terms of the event of Mubahila, I guess I'll describe it. When you look at both Sunni and Shia exegetical courses or sources, tafsir sources on a verse of the Quran that says, bring yourselves, bring your sons, bring your women, and let us pray to God to see who is speaking the truth, and so on. The question is, what happened? And so when you look at the sources regarding this event, there's this belief that the Christians of Najran came to Medina, and when they swore that Jesus was the Son of God, and the Prophet is swearing that he's not, and there's this ancient Arab practice to say, let us call on God to bring a curse or damnation on the one who's lying. And when a verse of the Quran talks about this, it's stated that instead of the Prophet bringing his companions, he brought Ali, Fatima, Hassan, and Hussein with him. And that was seen as like this very momentous occasion in Shia thought and history. I'd say, there are many events like this that you can point to as momentous in religious history, or in what we can call sacred history. And you can point to the day of Ghadir, where the Prophet raises Ali's hand and says, whoever took me as his Mawla, Ali is his Mawla. Or you can point to the day of Badr, when Ali is described as, this ferocious warrior that, sets him apart from others, and all of these other events. Or, Karbala, where Hussein is killed. These are important events in like on the Shia calendar, you could say. In the in Sunni culture, there's not, perhaps in being anti-Shia in polemics, there's a gut reaction to sometimes a knee-jerk reaction to reject the authenticity of these events. But there are many Sunnis throughout history who took these events as part of that history, but it wasn't important. It wasn't at the center of Sunni culture to think about these things and talk about these things, while it's at the center of Shia culture. And the reason, the devil that's in the details is how you interpret these events. Why is it so important to Shiism that the Mubahala occurred? It's because it's an example in which it seems to point to the superiority of the family of the Prophet, their infallibility, their purity, right? If you're reading in between the lines, it's like it's saying, okay, these are people who never told a lie, for example. But you can, with the scholars that I study in my book, Al-Jahid, for example, he'll say you can take any hadith from the Prophet and make an argument that that person should be the Prophet's successor. So you could do that with Bilal. You could do this with Abu Dhar. You could do this with all of these other individuals, because day to day, we have all of these statements in which the Prophet seems to be praising them in ways that he didn't praise someone else. And so the fact that you have a community around the Ahl al-Bayt that argues this is just one example of how we can do this. So this is an outsider Mu'tazili saying this type of phenomenon can occur. And I look at many of these hadith in my book and how Sunnis interpreted them, not to necessarily reject that they happened in history, but would say, okay, these are important events. They are righteous people. The Mubahala did occur, but it doesn't unambiguously say that they should be the Prophet's successors.
But don't you think that Ghadir actually unambiguously does say that? Like, I mean, the events of Ghadir, as I understand them and as I've read them, as I've grown up, now I'm 40 and still questioning, but
yeah,
the events of Ghadir to me are, the Prophet takes his hand and raises his arm and says, whosoever I am the Mawla of, that is,
right.
Ali is
I can
Mawla,
address
right?
that.
Like,
yeah,
yeah,
I can
I'd
address
love
that.
to hear the
Sure.
perspective, because I just, question everything now.
Sure, I'll take this second question, but if there's a follow-up question, then we should talk after the event as well, so we can take questions from others. But let's say an outsider, someone with no dog in the fight, doesn't identify as Muslim or Sunni or Shia or whatever. When you look at the Shia argument, Man kuntu mawla fa aliyun mawla, is an argument that the Prophet is saying Ali is his successor. They would say that is an argument, that's a logical fallacy. It's an argument from ambiguity, in that the word caliphate or successorship doesn't appear in this, and it requires an interpretation that you can read this statement in a way where it doesn't necessarily mean political leadership, ruler of the Muslim empire, or so on. In fact, there are modern Shia philosophers like Abdul Karim Sarush that would say this is about marja'iyya. Who's the marja after the Prophet? Meaning, who is your source for spiritual authority for what is right and wrong? And a marja doesn't need to be the ruler of the entire world. That's a different category altogether. It can be talking about spirituality, religious authority after the Prophet. Meaning, once the Prophet dies, how do you know how to pray, how to fast, how to do the pillars of Islam, how to interpret Quran, and so how to apply to the Quran? These are all questions related to spiritual and religious authority. And even if you were saying that this statement where the Prophet says, whoever took me as his Mawla, then Ali is his Mawla, is an important one, it doesn't necessarily have something to do with how Arabs understood politics at that time. And so they would say, for someone to say it must mean that's an argument from ambiguity, because the Prophet used the word Mawla instead of Khalifa, and he could have said Khalifa or Amir. But the other question you had asked is about Ali being born in the Kaaba. And I would say that there are, when you look at, I'll write this in the chat, whenever you read literature about saints, it's known as hagiography. And hagiography is not history. Hagiography is literature written so a believer can increase their faith, and so they can to inspire the faith of a believer. And the content of hagiography is basically literature about holy people. And so a lot of Islamic texts about the Prophet, about Ali, about the companions, or so on, would qualify as hagiography rather than history. And you can find the same sort of literature in Christianity, where it's like they're doing miracles all of the time. They're, you know, the point of the story is to show why someone should convert to Islam or believe in this person being a friend of God or a saint. And that literature isn't necessarily historical. It's possible that Ali was born in the Kaaba, but I guess the statement here is that it's part of a world of hagiography, and we can't know for sure. And even if that is the case, you know, that may not be meaningful in terms that are, you know, clear cut for an outsider who, again, doesn't have any dog in the fight in terms of polemics. But thank you for your question.
No, thank you. That was wonderful. I'm gonna put myself on mute and take my video off.
No problem. Thank you so much for those questions, Zaida. And again, we want this to be an opening forum, so please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question directly to Dr. Nebil, or you can also put it into the chat. We have about 10 more minutes with our amazing scholar, so please use this opportunity to ask questions or share comments as well.
Also,
go ahead, Professor.
If there was clarification that any of the audience members wanted to have on any of the comments that I made or in part of the presentation, I'm welcome. I welcome the opportunity to clarify.
Thank you so much. I think there's a question in the chat. Thank you so much, Rita, for posing this question. It is, positionality is critical. Professor, what is your conclusion on Imam Ali's succession? Did the Prophet intend for Imam Ali to be his successor?
You know, I've been asking that question for 20 some odd years, and I can't speak with certainty on it. But in terms of my own personal leanings, it seems that Ali was favored by the Prophet. Again, if you don't have a dog in the fight, if you're looking at it from an outsider, you could say the Prophet says these things about everyone, and you can interpret them in ways that says that it's it's about succession. But in terms of Ali's claim, what I can say with more certainty or on certain grounds or on stronger grounds is that Ali himself seemed to have considered himself a candidate to succeed the Prophet Muhammad when he died, and that the Hashemite tribe themselves believed this, and that there were other companions who supported his candidacy as well. So that was there. And so the fact that you have Bukhari's Sahih that says that Ali, Fatima, and those that were with them didn't pledge, like the Hashemites didn't pledge allegiance to the first Caliph Abu Bakr for 6 months, they withheld the Pledge of Allegiance. It's because they felt that their claim had been ignored and that the first succession happened in ways in which they couldn't participate. That I can say with certainty. And so if the question is, why did Ali believe that? People have been asking that question for different reasons. For Shia orthodoxy, it's that they'll say, oh, because he was explicit, you know, it was all clear, it was all laid out, it was clear the Prophet, you know, said it, that he should be his successor and so on. That doesn't seem to, in the literature, that doesn't seem to be the case. That orthodoxy developed, Shia orthodoxy developed to have that position. But if you look at the early, you know, early Shia texts that are talking about how Ali talked about this or how early companions talked about it, they were trying to convince, they were trying to persuade others of Ali's candidacy. And if you're saying that the Prophet explicitly said this already, then no persuasion or, you know, convincing would be necessary using all of these other different methods that they use.
Thank you so much for answering that question, Professor Nebil. I think Anika has a question for you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Husayn. I want to ask a question around how the manifestations of this question of who the successor was of the Prophet, the manifestations of it, how it's playing out currently politically, and how we as a Muslim community can, you know, feel more united instead of divided. What would you say to that? You know, and I say this also in light of the fact, like, you know, you have the Wahhabi movement who totally says, oh yeah, Shias are not Muslims, and then, you know, and like what towards that question, towards that manifestation, I would like to know from you.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say that one of the contributions that I make in this book, and hopefully in a future book, which I hope to entitle Almost Shia, Zeal for Ali and Sunni Islam, is to challenge the conceptions that we have that to be a Sunni means X, Y, and Z, and to be a Shi means A, B, and C, and that those never agree with one another, that they are always in contestation. What I want to do is break down those barriers or boundaries and say, no, actually, there were Sunnis who believed Ali was the spiritual successor to the Prophet. He was his heir, and that he had a claim to the caliphate. And had he become caliph, he would have been, amazing one right after the Prophet. But, we still respect the first three caliphs, right? There were Sunnis that held that position that people will say, oh, that's a Shi'i position. Or that there were Shi'is that had a very ecumenical approach to understanding Islamic history. It wasn't like a one that was condemning the Sunni position, but one that respected it and showed respect for Sunni culture. In terms of this modern day period in which there is heightened hyper-partisanship, I tried to draw the parallel to American society now, where part of the steps towards hyperpartisanship and violence is one where you identify this group, where you say, I am X and they are Y, and Y is bad. And that partisanship is extremely extremely problematic. It's very dangerous. And I think a pluralist ethic is important. So within the Sunni community, there is some of that pluralism in terms of Islamic law. So people don't usually condemn each other anymore. If one person's a Hanafi and the other person's a Maliki, like there's this ethic of like, we respect all of them as valid. And I think there's been a move in the past 20 years to respect non-Sunni schools as well as valid. So there's this Amman declaration in which it's not just the 4 Sunni schools, but there are also 4 non-Sunni schools, the 12er Shi'i or the Jafari, the Zaydi, the Ibadi, and there are other schools as well, the Zahiri, where you can say, or the Ismaili, where you can respect schools even if you disagree with their principles, as like, look, anyone who faces the Qibla, anyone who faces Mecca to pray and believes in the Quran and the Prophet should be respected as Muslim, and that there's nothing that they can do to, you could say, invalidate their Muslim identity, except by going against those 2 principles, either not believing in God or not believing in Muhammad anymore. And it's at that case that it's in those cases that a person would say, I no longer identify as Muslim, and other people would say that. But this movement, and you mentioned Wahhabism, which is like an ultra anti-Shi'i, anti-Sufi, anti-modernist, like there are a lot of things that Wahhabism is, but at its essence, it's a hyper-partisan, intolerant group. And so I think part of the way that we can move forward is to make sure we don't dehumanize people who are different from us. I think as Muslims, there are these intra-Muslim rivalries where, yes, you can dehumanize people who are not Sunni or of another sect, but conspiracy theories also run wild in a lot of Muslim circles, where there's a strong anti-Jewish sentiment, right? Where there's like their anti-Jewish conspiracy theories that run wild, and there's this tendency to dehumanize those who are different and to view them with suspicion. And so we gotta, I think with younger generations, people who are, let's say, less than 30, I think that's not as bad as it was before. People are more accepting of people who are different from them, even if they don't understand why they're different, even if they don't understand how they're different fully, whether it's in terms of gender, sexuality, religion, whatever. They're just more accepting, just saying, look, we can't dehumanize people because they're different from us. I think older generations had a harder time with that. And there's a famous scholar at Georgetown, Jonathan Brown, who says, there are parts of my he said, I identify as Hanbali. And there are parts of my Hanbali heritage which are just poison. It's just straight poison. And we have to recognize that we can't continue to perpetuate that in this modern period, that there are old school, from 1,000 years ago, scholars who would say things that were awful about dehumanizing women, dehumanizing, Muslims of other schools. And I think we have to get to a point where we recognize, let's take the good of our religion, but when it comes to dehumanize others, we'll stop doing that. I think that's something that anyone following any school of thought, any religion, any political group can use to be a better person in this time of hyperpartisanship.
Wow, thank you so much for touching on some of these really important themes. I think we have maybe time for one more question. We want to be respectful of our speakers' time and also all of you that have joined us in the audience. Ola, I see that you have your hand up.
Yes, this was very interesting, really, and I agree with everything you just said. I have a friend, a few friends, of all kinds of friends, and one of them, she's Shia, and she said to me, I had a presentation, and somebody was asking, presentation about Islam, and so somebody was asking, like, the Shia, difference between Sunni and all this stuff. So she got up and she said, when Islam started, there was nothing. It was just Islam. So she just kind of made it clear, and like she made it simple, and then that was like no more questions. Like she just kind of, says that's simply like that. That's it. We're all we're all the same.
Thank you. I mean, one of the most, again, I mentioned this, one of the most beautiful things that I saw was an early scholar that said, anyone who faces the Qibla is a Muslim. That's it. Just stop it. It's like, stop with the internal fighting, saying if they don't believe A, B, C, D, E, F, G, then they're not, they're misguided and they're blah, 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 blah. Just like stop. And once I had that perspective of, oh, there were scholars who were so broad-minded, they just viewed the Muslim community as Ahl al-Qibla. That just made total sense as well. So thank you for that comment.
And with that, I'm reminded that there is one more question in the chat that I think might sum up sort of all of your amazing points. Professor Nebil, the question is, those of us immersed in social justice spaces believe that without accountability, there can be no justice. In terms of the massacre and murder of Ahlul Bayt, what is the significance of the accountability for the massacre and helping the Ummah truly heal? And then with this question, we'll close, inshallah.
I think in every generation, there are instances of genocide and there are massacres, and it's important that we look at the steps that occur before a population becomes the object of a massacre and an object of genocide. And hyperpartisanship is one of those things, identifying them as this evil group, targeting them, and then militias targeting them. And then afterwards, once the massacre occurs, you'll have a power apparatus like the state that denies that it existed. It denies that a massacre occurs. And so part of the culture of Shiism is one where the survivors of the massacre that occurred, 61 Hijri, about 50 years after the Prophet's death, when Hussein and many of the Prophet's great-grandchildren were killed, by a Muslim army, an army claiming to follow the Caliph. Part of the trauma that occurred there is that the survivors of that massacre would commemorate it each year, share the stories with their family and their followers, and Shiis continue to remember that each year. And it's this, this trauma that they point to, saying, look, this happened in history. Why don't people recognize this happened and take a moment to stop and clarify, how is it that you could have had a Muslim caliph do this and a Muslim army do this? And so this question of accountability and healing, once you recognize that it was a Muslim caliph that did this, and the Umayyads were responsible for this. And so there's this question of what do we do from there? How do Muslims, where do Muslims go from there? Well, it would be in recognizing that it happened, and perhaps stepping back and not praising those who perpetuated these massacres. Because, you know, I'll give a modern example. In the hyperpartisanship that exists in Iraq, there are people who will say that Saddam Hussein was still this great hero because he was the hero for the Arabs. He was a hero for Muslims. He stood up to Muslims. He stood up to America. There are parts of the Muslim world that will say Osama bin Laden was a hero because he stood up to America. He did blah, 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 blah. It's very problematic when you take murderers as, quote, you know, heroes when they perpetuate murder. And there is a tendency in some cultures among some groups, because of hyperpartisanship, to do this with early Islamic history as well. And I think that's the point that the questioner is getting to. And so we have to be careful of doing that.
Wow. Thank you so much for that powerful reminder, Professor Nebil, for being with us today, enlightening us and sharing your knowledge with us. May Allah continue to guide you in your knowledge seeking. And we want to thank all of you in our audience for being here with us today, for tuning in, for asking such amazing questions, and just being overall wonderful audience. We hope we can continue to host more of these workshops and sessions virtually. In the chat box, we shared a quick exit survey. If you can fill that out, that just helps us learn what went well today, what could have gone better, and how to bring more of these events to you. So we really value your feedback. And then we also shared a link to Professor Nebil's book, Opposing the Imam. So we hope you can support him and his endeavors, and buy a book, share it with your family and your friends. And with that, I think we will close. Professor Nebil, if you have anything else you want to share? Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to thank everyone for attending, and in the chat, if there are follow-up questions that people would like to ask, or, you know, I'm a professor, so I take office hours and I can take them through Zoom. So I'm in the chat, I'm putting my email address.
Perfect.
You're welcome to send a question, and you know, we could set up an appointment to discuss this more.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that information. And we'll also send a follow-up email to you all with Professor Nebil's contact information that he shared in the chat, and links to his book. And yeah, hopefully we can continue to organize more of these and be with you all, inshallah. So with that, assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you. This was great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Hafiz.
everybody.